The town of Red Mesa sat like a sun-baked jewel in the heart of the Arizona Territory, where the dust never truly settled, and the law was written by whoever had the strongest hand. And no hand was stronger or richer than that of Sheriff Thomas Keene. Thomas had built his name on grit, gunpowder, and a reputation that made men flinch when he passed. He wore his badge not as a symbol of duty but as a crown. The silver star glimmered against his spotless vest, polished every morning by a servant who dared not meet his eyes. To most, he was a hero. To those who knew better, he was a man who measured justice by the weight of gold. His fortune came from many things: land, cattle, and the dusty veins of copper that ran beneath his property like buried treasure. But it was his iron control over Red Mesa that made him truly powerful. No deal was struck without his blessing. No man rose in influence without his nod. Even the local judge, a weary man with trembling hands, was rumored to consult Keene before every verdict. The townsfolk admired him, feared him, and gossiped about him in equal measure. He was a man who seemed to command the very desert, tall, broad-shouldered, and immaculate even in the heat that made others wilt. His mustache was trimmed sharp as a knife's edge, his boots gleamed, and his eyes, cold blue and calculating, missed nothing. Yet for all his wealth and control, Thomas Keene was a man deeply uneasy with weakness. He despised it in others and feared it in himself. To him, mercy was softness, humility was cowardice, and compassion was a flaw of lesser men. His authority had hardened into arrogance long ago, and he wore it like armor. Behind the walls of his grand house, the largest for miles, Keene ruled not only the town but his family with the same unyielding hand. Servants tiptoed through the halls. Guests were careful not to stay past dark. Even his wife, before she passed from fever years ago, had lived in quiet submission to his temper and his pride. Only one person had ever dared to challenge him: his daughter, Clara. Clara had inherited her mother's quiet grace but her father's spirit of fire. As a child, she would race horses through the canyons and climb trees in her Sunday dress, earning both admiration and scolding in equal measure. Thomas adored her fiercely but demanded she reflect his image of perfection: strong, unblemished, and obedient. Then came the accident. It was a spring morning, and the air was sweet with sage when the horse bolted. No one knew exactly what spooked it. A rattler, perhaps, but the animal reared and Clara fell. When they brought her home, her body was broken in ways no doctor could mend. She would never walk again. The sheriff changed that day, though he would never admit it. Where once he had seen his daughter as his proud reflection, he now saw only frailty, a mirror he refused to look into. He paid for the best care money could buy, but his visits grew fewer, his words colder. The laughter that had once filled the Keene house vanished like rain in the desert. Clara's room became her world, a wide window overlooking the courtyard, where she would watch her father mount his horse and ride out each morning, a figure of authority against the rising sun. She loved him still, but she began to see what others whispered about: the man who mistook power for virtue. To the town, the sheriff remained the same: rich, commanding, untouchable. But in the quiet hours, when he passed his daughter's closed door, something in his chest would tighten. He could not bear to face what her paralysis had done, not just to her, but to his pride. For Sheriff Thomas Keene, the greatest injustice in life was not what fate took away. It was being forced to confront what he could not control. And so, in his mind, Clara's broken body became an insult, a wound to his authority. He buried that feeling beneath work, whiskey, and wealth, never realizing that the pride he clung to so fiercely was already beginning to rot him from within. Clara Keene had once been the sunbeam of Red Mesa, bright, untamed, and unafraid. The townsfolk used to say that when she rode through the main street on her chestnut mare, even the wind seemed to follow her lead. She had her mother's grace, her father's boldness, and a laugh that could melt the sternest faces at the general store. But the accident changed everything. It had happened 2 years before, during one of her father's annual ranch events. The sheriff's brand was burned on every steer for 50 miles, and he liked to celebrate that dominance with a weekend of races, games, and whiskey. Clara, 17 then, insisted on riding in the men's race, a challenge that made the spectators roar and her father frown. "You'll break your neck," Sheriff Keene had growled that morning, tightening his gloves. "Then I'll do it faster than any man in this town. She'd shot back with that spark in her eye. He almost smiled at that. Almost. When the race began, she took off like lightning, dust flying in her wake. Her hair streamed behind her like a banner of rebellion. But halfway through the canyon pass, something went wrong. A rattlesnake slithered from the rocks, the horse spooked, and the world upended. The crowd reached her too late. The doctor from Prescott arrived the next morning, his face drawn tight beneath the brim of his hat. He told the sheriff what no amount of money could change. Her spine was shattered. She would never walk again. The house that had once echoed with her laughter turned silent. The sheriff built her a grand room on the second floor, furnished with soft carpets and wide windows, as if comfort could fill the space left by her loss. He hired a nurse, a tutor, and even a pianist to entertain her. But Clara noticed what he didn't say, what he couldn't hide. The pity in his eyes was laced with disappointment. At first, she tried to be the daughter he wanted. She smiled, read books, and learned embroidery. But when he looked at her, it was as though he saw a ghost of someone who used to be his pride. "Don't sit by the window all day," he'd say, his tone more command than concern. "You need to look strong." "I can't stand," she'd reply softly without sarcasm. "But I can still look." That kind of answer irritated him. He preferred silence to truth. As weeks turned into months, her father visited her less often. He buried himself in work, patrolling the borders of his lands, quarreling with miners, and crushing disputes with his brand of rough justice. Whenever anyone asked about Clara, he would say, "She's comfortable," as though comfort were the same as happiness. But Clara was not comfortable. She was restless. Her world had shrunk to the space between her bed and the balcony. Yet her mind roamed far beyond the limits of her father's mansion. She read voraciously about history, native tribes, faraway lands. The more she learned, the clearer it became that her father's law was not the same as justice. Sometimes from her window she'd watch a group of Apache prisoners brought into town in chains. The sheriff would ride ahead, his back straight, his expression cold. She'd hear him boasting in the saloon later, calling them savages and vermin. Clara didn't understand how a man could take such pride in breaking others. Her nurse, an older Mexican woman named Inez, once whispered, "Your papa has a hard heart, Nina. He thinks strength means never feeling pain." Clara nodded. She knew that better than anyone. Her father had built walls around himself so tall that even love couldn't climb them anymore. Yet she still loved him, in the way a child loves a storm, both terrified and fascinated. Deep down, she hoped he might one day look at her and see not a burden, but a daughter worth admiring again. That hope would keep her alive longer than any medicine. But it would also make what came next, the sheriff's cruel joke, all the more unbearable. For soon, fate would place an Apache warrior in their lives, and Sheriff Thomas Keene, blinded by arrogance, would make a decision that would change both their destinies forever. The summer the Apache raids began, Red Mesa grew nervous. Smoke was seen curling from the distant ridges, cattle vanished from the northern pastures, and traders whispered of a new band of warriors who struck like ghosts and left no tracks behind. Sheriff Thomas Keene, of course, saw it as both a threat and an opportunity. He rode with a posse of 12 men, armed with repeating rifles and arrogance. To him, the Apache were not people defending their land. They were obstacles to be subdued, trophies to be paraded before a fearful town. He promised the ranchers safety, the miners protection, and himself glory. For days they scoured the desert. The sun burned the skin off their necks and sand filled their boots, but Keene pressed on, driven not by duty but pride. Finally, at dawn on the 5th day, they spotted movement near the dry creek beds east of Dead Horse Gulch. A lone Apache warrior was scouting the ridge. Keene raised his rifle before the others even saw the figure clearly. The shot rang out and echoed across the cliffs, startling the hawks. The warrior tumbled down the slope but did not die. When the men reached him, they found a young man, no older than 20, bloodied but alive, his dark eyes burning with defiance. "Bind him," Keene ordered. They tied his wrists with rawhide and threw him across a horse like game after a hunt. The men joked and laughed, but the warrior said nothing. Not a word, not a plea. He simply stared at the sheriff, calm and steady, even as dust caked his wounds. When they rode back into Red Mesa, the town gathered to see. Children pointed, and old men spat tobacco into the dirt. Sheriff Keene dismounted, dusted his coat, and stood tall beside his captive. "This," he announced to the crowd, is what happens to those who think they can steal from us." The crowd murmured approval. To them, Keene was the wall between civilization and chaos. But Clara, watching from her balcony, saw something else entirely. The young Apache's face was proud, not beaten. His eyes met hers for a fleeting moment, steady, unashamed, alive. It unsettled her. For the first time in months, she felt the weight of her father's brand of justice pressing against her chest. The man's name, she would later learn, was Taza, meaning morning sun in his people's tongue. He was the son of a respected Apache leader, captured while scouting the movements of Keene's patrols. To his tribe, he was a warrior. To Keene, he was a prize. The sheriff had him locked in a small holding cell behind the courthouse, the same one where drunks and petty thieves spent their nights. But Keene visited often, not out of necessity but curiosity. He wanted to see the man who dared to stare him down without fear. "You're lucky I didn't finish the job in the canyon," he said one evening, standing just outside the bars. "If your people had any sense, they'd learn when to stay in their place." Taza met his gaze and replied in halting English, "Desert belonged to no man. You build fences." Desert laughs. Keene's eyes narrowed. "You've got a smart tongue for a savage." Taza said nothing else. Silence, Keene realized, could sting more than insult. That night, while Red Mesa slept, Clara asked Inez to wheel her down to the jail. She couldn't explain why. Perhaps it was curiosity, perhaps guilt, but she needed to see him up close. The air was cool and heavy with the smell of iron and dust. Taza sat upright, his wounds roughly bandaged, his eyes alert even in half-light. When Clara entered, he rose slightly out of respect despite the chains. "You shouldn't be here," she whispered. "You are the sheriff's daughter," he said simply. "Then this is your cage, too." The word struck her like a slap. She couldn't answer. For a moment, she only stared at him, realizing that though she was free to move within her gilded walls, she was just as imprisoned by her father's pride as this man was by his bars. Outside, the desert wind howled against the shutters, and the moon cut sharp lines across the dusty floor. Neither of them knew it then, but that quiet meeting, between a wounded warrior and a paralyzed girl, would set in motion a story that would break the sheriff's pride forever. 2 weeks after Taza's capture, Sheriff Thomas Keene was restless. The town had already celebrated his victory. The saloon offered him free whiskey, the miners toasted his bravery, and the local newspaper printed a story calling him the Shield of Red Mesa. But the sheriff wasn't satisfied. He'd grown addicted to attention the way a drunk needs his bottle, and when the applause faded, he went looking for new ways to remind everyone of his power. The Apache prisoner, still locked in the cell behind the courthouse, was becoming more of a nuisance than a trophy. He refused to speak, refused to flinch, refused even to lower his gaze when the sheriff walked past. To Keene, that quiet defiance felt like a personal insult. "He's not worth feeding," said one of the deputies one morning, spitting into the dust. Keene smirked. "Oh, I'm not done with him yet." That night, after too much whiskey and too many cheers from men who feared him more than they respected him, the sheriff had an idea, one that even his closest companions thought too cruel to speak aloud. But pride, once bruised, can twist into something darker than anger. "Tomorrow," he told them, "I'll give our savage something he won't forget." The next morning dawned sharp and golden. The sheriff ordered Taza brought to the courtyard behind the jail. The townspeople gathered, curious, sensing there would be some spectacle. The sheriff always put on a show. Clara watched from her balcony, confusion knitting her brow. Her father had been pacing since dawn, his face tight with the kind of grin that never reached his eyes. When the prisoner was dragged out, still in chains but walking upright, the sheriff raised his hands for silence. "Folks," he began, "you've seen what happens when law meets savagery, but I've been thinking, maybe this one here's not all bad. Maybe what he needs isn't a bullet. Maybe what he needs is family." A ripple of laughter moved through the crowd, uncertain but obedient. The sheriff turned toward his daughter's window. His voice boomed, cruelly theatrical. "My dear Clara," he called, "you've been alone too long, haven't you? Maybe this fine warrior will keep you company. I'll give you to him. See if he can make something useful out of what fate left behind." The laughter this time was louder, sharper, the kind that hides discomfort behind cruelty. Clara froze. For a moment she couldn't breathe. The words hung in the air like smoke, poisoning everything they touched. Her father, her own father, had just offered her as a joke. She gripped the arms of her chair, her knuckles white. The sound of laughter below rose and fell like a tide, but Taza didn't laugh. He stood still, eyes fixed on the sheriff, the muscles in his jaw tight as iron. Then he turned slowly and looked up at the balcony. Their eyes met, his calm and unflinching, hers trembling but alive. The sheriff was still speaking, still feeding off the crowd's approval. When Clara did something no one expected, her voice rang out clear and sharp. "If that's your will, Father, then so be it." The laughter stopped. Even the sheriff blinked, unsure whether he'd heard her right. "What did you say?" "I said," she repeated louder now, "if you've decided my worth is to be given away, then I accept it. But remember this, when you give me to him, you'll lose me forever." A hush fell over the courtyard. Her father's face turned the color of old brick. "Don't be foolish, Clara." "I'm not the fool," she said softly. "You are." The crowd didn't know where to look. Some men shifted awkwardly. Others stared at the ground. The sheriff, for the first time in years, had no words. He stormed inside a few moments later, his pride bleeding beneath his skin. Clara sat by the window, her heart pounding, realizing what she had done, that her challenge, born of anger and pain, had set something unstoppable in motion. That night, as the desert wind whispered against the shutters, the sheriff's joke began to harden into a cruel reality. In his fury, he would see it through, and in doing so, he would unknowingly hand his daughter the very freedom he had stolen from her. The night after her father's public humiliation, Clara did not sleep. The laughter of the townspeople echoed in her mind like ghostly music. But it wasn't their cruelty that haunted her most. It was the look in her father's eyes. Not rage, not sorrow, but disbelief. For the first time, Sheriff Thomas Keene had seen someone stand against him, and worse, it had been his own daughter. The following morning, the house felt different. The servants moved quietly, avoiding her room as though she carried a sickness. Even Inez, her nurse, looked pale and fearful. "Niña," Inez whispered as she adjusted Clara's blanket. "You shouldn't have spoken like that." "He's a man who doesn't forget insults," Clara smiled faintly. "Then he'll remember me for the rest of his life." She meant it not as rebellion, but as truth. For years she had lived behind the veil of her father's pride, his perfect little girl, his trophy of decency in a world of dust and greed. But that girl had died on the canyon floor the day her horse fell. The woman who replaced her was quiet, yes, but not broken. That morning, the sheriff entered her room without knocking. He stood by the doorway, still wearing his badge, his hat shadowing his face. For a moment, neither spoke. "So," he said at last, "you think you've shamed me?" "No," Clara replied softly. "I think you've shamed yourself." He took a slow breath, his jaw tight. "Do you understand what you said in front of the whole town? You made me a fool. You did that without my help." The words hit him like a slap. His voice dropped low and dangerous. "You'll regret that, Tone. I already regret being your daughter." For a second, Sheriff Keene's hand twitched near his belt. But instead of anger, he laughed, a cold, joyless sound that sent chills through the room. "So be it," he said. "You want to stand by your words? Then you'll live by them." Clara met his eyes without flinching. "Then let me go," he hesitated. Her calm unnerved him. Somewhere deep beneath his anger, a small, twisted sense of pride flickered. His daughter, even crippled, had his steel. But pride is a cruel companion. "Fine," he said finally. "You'll go to him," Inez gasped. "Señor, no." "Silence," Keene barked. "You wanted a show of will, girl? You'll get it. I'll see you delivered to that Apache tomorrow." Then he turned and left. When the door shut, Inez began to cry quietly. "He won't do it," she said between sobs. "He's just angry." Clara looked toward the window where the desert stretched endless and gold under the noonday sun. "He will," she said, "because it hurts his pride more to take back his word than to lose me." That night she didn't cry. She packed what little she could, books, a small silver comb, and a locket containing a picture of her mother. She asked Inez to braid her hair tight, not for beauty but for resolve. When dawn came, Sheriff Keene arrived with 2 deputies and a wagon. The townsfolk had gathered again, drawn by gossip like flies to honey. Clara was lifted gently from her chair and placed in the back of the wagon, her dignity wrapped around her like armor. The sheriff stood before her, You can still change your mind, he said, though the challenge in his voice betrayed his hope she wouldn't. Clara looked up at him. I already have. Taza was brought from the jail, chains still at his wrists, his expression unreadable. When he saw her, he gave a small nod, not of pity but of respect. Sheriff Keene gestured to him. She's yours now. You want to play husband to a cripple, fine by me. Take her and be gone from my town by sundown. A murmur rippled through the crowd, half laughter, half disbelief. Clara's eyes met her father's one last time. Goodbye, Sheriff, not father. Then the wagon rolled out toward the horizon, carrying a paralyzed girl, a shackled warrior, and the fragile beginnings of something her father could never understand. Freedom. As the dust rose behind them, Sheriff Keene stood alone in the courtyard surrounded by silence. For the first time in his life, the applause he always craved never came. The wagon rattled away from Red Mesa under a sun that burned white and merciless in the sky. The air shimmered above the road, the heat twisting the horizon into waves. Behind them, the town shrank to a blur of wooden rooftops and false civility. Ahead lay the open desert, raw, vast, and untamed. Clara sat in the back of the wagon, her body jostling with every rut in the road. The deputies who had been ordered to escort them rode on either side, grim and silent, glancing occasionally at the bound Apache seated beside her. Taza's wrists were tied, his shirt torn at the shoulder where the bullet had grazed him weeks before. Yet he sat upright, steady, as if the desert itself sustained him. For hours no one spoke. The creak of wood and the rhythmic clop of hooves were the only sounds. Dust coated their skin, turning sweat into mud. Clara's lips cracked. Her throat felt like sandpaper. Finally, one of the deputies, a younger man with kind eyes, looked back at her and muttered, "I'm sorry, miss." I didn't think he'd really go through with it. Clara managed a faint smile. Neither did I. The sheriff's orders were simple. Deliver them to the outer ridge of the San Pedro Valley, leave them with supplies enough for 2 days, and return. Beyond that, they were on their own. It was meant as a cruel gesture, a mockery of mercy. By late afternoon, the sun dipped toward the jagged teeth of the mountains. The deputies stopped near a dry riverbed, where a few stunted mesquite trees offered the illusion of shade. They untied Taza and dropped a small sack beside him, flour, a canteen, a blanket. "This is it," one said. "Best make the most of it." Clara was lifted gently down and placed on the hard ground. Her legs, lifeless from the waist down, ached anyway, as though her body refused to accept its limits. She turned her gaze toward the horizon, endless and orange with dusk. When the deputies mounted up again, the younger one hesitated. "Miss Keene," he said softly, "if you head east, you'll reach a trading post in 3 days' time. Maybe less if someone helps you." Clara nodded, though she knew she couldn't travel 3 miles on her own. "God keep you," he whispered, tipping his hat before spurring his horse. When the sound of hooves faded, silence swallowed the desert whole. Only the wind remained, carrying the scent of dust and distant rain. Taza stood for a moment watching the horizon, then turned to her. His expression was unreadable, his movements deliberate and calm. He cut the ropes from his wrists with a sharp stone, then crouched before her. "You should eat," he said quietly, his English halting but clear. Clara looked at him. "You're free now." "You don't have to help me." He met her gaze. "You are not safe alone." A flicker of anger crossed her face. "You don't have to pity me." Taza shook his head. "Not pity, respect. You spoke against the man who owns this land. That is strength." The words caught her off guard. No one had called her strong since the accident. He began gathering branches, moving with silent efficiency. When night fell, he built a small fire, its glow pushing back the darkness. Clara watched him work, the quiet focus in his hands, the way he seemed to listen to the land as if it whispered its secrets to him. She realized with a strange calm that for the first time in years she wasn't surrounded by walls or servants or her father's shadow. The desert was brutal, yes, but it was honest. As stars filled the sky, she spoke softly. "Do you hate him?" "My father?" Taza fed another stick into the fire. "No, hate is heavy. Desert teaches to travel light." She smiled faintly, then looked up at the stars, glittering cold and infinite. In that endless silence, Clara Keene, once the caged daughter of Red Mesa, felt something she hadn't in a long time. Possibility. And though she didn't yet know it, this harsh, unforgiving journey would not be her punishment. It would be her rebirth. The desert did not forgive weakness, but it also revealed truth. By the second day, Clara's skin was blistered from the sun. Her lips bled from dryness. The canteen held only a swallow of water, which she pressed to Taza's hands first. He refused. She insisted. For a moment their eyes met over that single drop of mercy, and something unspoken passed between them, a recognition of shared defiance. Taza had built a makeshift sled from branches and rope, tying it to his waist so he could pull her across the sand. He moved slowly but steadily, never complaining. Clara had protested at first, ashamed of being dragged like a burden. "I can crawl," she had said. He had looked at her with quiet amusement. "You can lead, I pull. You tell me where the sun goes." So she guided him by instinct, east by morning light, north by the shadow of the hills, west when the wind turned sharp and smelled of rain. Her voice became their compass, her eyes their map. That night they camped beside a dry arroyo where the air was cooler. Taza gathered prickly pear fruit, slicing the skin with his knife and offering the pulp to her. Clara bit into it, wincing at the bitter taste but grateful. She studied him by firelight, the scars across his shoulders, the steady hands, the stillness in his movements. He was unlike any man she had known. No bluster, no vanity, only purpose. "Why did you help me?" she asked finally. Taza's gaze lingered on the flames. "Because you helped me," he said simply. "I didn't do anything." "You saw me," he said. "Not all men see." Clara turned away, embarrassed by the warmth in her chest. For years her father's gaze had passed through her like light through glass, seeing only what he wished. But Taza's eyes, calm and steady, made her feel visible again. When dawn came, they continued west. The terrain grew crueler, jagged rock and thorn scrub. Clara's body ached from sitting, her arms raw from bracing herself on the sled. She could feel her strength fading, yet she refused to ask him to stop. At midday, Taza halted beside a patch of tall grass. He knelt and began digging with his hands. Minutes later, a trickle of muddy water surfaced. "You found it," Clara whispered. "The desert always gives," he said, "if you ask the right way." He filled the canteen and handed it to her first. She drank deeply, tears mixing with dust on her cheeks. They rested in silence until the wind changed, carrying the faint scent of smoke. Distant, but human. Taza stiffened. "Settlers," he murmured. "We stay hidden." They moved to a nearby cave as night fell, its walls cool and echoing with the sounds of coyotes in the distance. Clara's hands trembled as she tried to light the fire herself. The flint slipped from her fingers twice before she finally sparked flame. Taza watched her, then nodded. "Good," her brow furrowed. "It took me forever." "You did not stop," he said. "That is forever's difference." Clara laughed softly, and for the first time since her accident, the sound didn't feel forced. It echoed off the cave walls, startling a bat into flight. That night, as the stars turned overhead, she spoke of her old life, the mansion, the music lessons, the way her father's praise had felt like a rationed privilege. Taza listened without judgment. When she finished, she looked at him. "You must think I'm weak," he shook his head. "You are not weak. You are learning what strength is," she frowned. "And what is it?" Taza pointed toward the horizon. "The river does not fight the rock. It finds another way." Clara looked at him for a long moment, then down at her motionless legs. For the first time, she didn't feel ashamed of them. Out here, away from the sheriff's walls and whispers, her body was not her cage. It was her starting point. The desert, cruel and beautiful, had stripped her down to the truth. Strength was not the ability to stand. It was the refusal to bow. By the time they reached the high mesas beyond the dry river valley, the desert had begun to change. The harsh sand softened into soil, and clusters of sage and yucca gave way to tall junipers. It was here, in the land where the red cliffs met the blue horizon, that Taza finally stopped. "This is home," he said, from her place on the sled. Clara looked down the ridge and saw it, a small Apache settlement nestled in the basin below, smoke rising gently from stone and adobe dwellings. The village seemed almost to grow from the earth itself, quiet and unassuming, yet alive with movement. Children ran between the huts. Women gathered herbs and dried meat on racks. Men worked silently, repairing weapons or carving wood. It was a world utterly different from the rigid, polished life she had known. There was no luxury here, no gold or marble floors, yet it pulsed with a kind of peace her father's grand house had never known. When they descended into the basin, a group of warriors appeared, bows drawn. Taza raised his hand and called out in his native tongue. The tension broke instantly. One of the men stepped forward, older, broad-shouldered, with lines of wisdom etched deep into his face. "Father," Taza said quietly. The older man's eyes softened, then hardened again as they landed on Clara. He asked something in Apache. Taza replied with patience, his tone calm but firm. The elder listened, his expression unreadable, then nodded once. They led Clara to a shaded hut near the riverbank. The women there looked at her with wary eyes, some whispering behind their hands. To them, she was the daughter of the man who had chained their sons and burned their homes, a symbol of pain and cruelty. But they said nothing. That night, as the sun fell, Taza sat beside her. "They do not trust you," he said plainly. "I don't blame them," Clara answered. He nodded. "You must show who you are." "Not with words. With what you do." "I can't even walk," she said bitterly. Taza looked at her a long moment. "Then you will teach sitting down." She frowned. "Teach what?" He pointed toward the children who gathered at a distance, peeking curiously into the hut. "They wish to know your language. You read, you write. Show them." The idea startled her, and yet something inside her stirred. The next morning she asked for a stick and a patch of smooth earth. The children came first, timid and curious. She drew letters in the dirt, A, B, C. They repeated them, giggling at the strange shapes. Soon their laughter filled the air, carrying farther than the smoke from the cook fires. The mothers began to watch, then to bring her food, roasted corn, bits of meat. The suspicion in their eyes slowly softened into cautious interest. Clara found herself smiling again, truly smiling, as the children scribbled their crooked letters into the ground and proudly shouted English words in heavy accents. Weeks passed. The desert cooled with autumn. Clara built strength in her arms, learning to move herself using carved wooden supports Taza made from mesquite branches. Her hands blistered at first, then calloused. She began helping the women grind corn, weave baskets, and sew hides. Though her legs were still lifeless, her spirit was not. In the evening, she would sit beside Taza near the fire, both of them silent, the flicker of flames reflecting in their eyes. She taught him words, hope, river, freedom, and he taught her his own, shash for bear, tsi for rock, she for sun. The exchange became their language, something private and real. One night, Taza's father approached her. "My son says you are strong," he said in careful English. "Stronger than most who walk?" Clara lowered her gaze. "I only do what I can." The old man smiled faintly. "That is all anyone can do." As the firelight flickered against her face, Clara realized she was no longer just the sheriff's daughter, no longer the broken girl in the upstairs room. She was a teacher, a helper, a member of something living and whole. And though her legs could not carry her, her heart had finally arrived somewhere it could stay. Winter came late to Red Mesa that year. The nights grew longer, colder and quieter. The wind howled through the empty streets like a ghost calling names no one wanted to hear. Sheriff Thomas Keene sat alone in his grand house, staring into the dying embers of the fireplace. The whiskey bottle beside him was half empty, though he couldn't remember how long he'd been drinking. His once immaculate boots were scuffed. His badge lay tossed on the table, catching the faint orange glow. It had been 3 months since Clara's departure. At first, he told himself she'd be back within days. She was fragile, unfit for the wilderness. The Apache would abandon her or worse. He imagined her crawling back to Red Mesa, begging forgiveness. He'd stand tall, arms crossed, and she'd finally understand who held the power. But the weeks passed, and no word came. Then the rumors started. A trader from the northern trails spoke of an Apache camp near the mesas. A peaceful one. He said he'd seen a white woman among them, teaching children to write in the dirt. Another claimed he'd heard her singing by a river, her voice blending with the drums. At first, Keene dismissed them as lies meant to taunt him. But when a second trader told the same story, his certainty began to crack. He rode out one dawn alone, following the trail west. The desert stretched endless and silent before him, the sky pale and hard as steel. He carried little food and less patience. Each mile gnawed at him, not because of the distance, but because of the thought he could be wrong. By the third day, he reached the high ridge overlooking the San Pedro Valley. There he saw smoke rising in thin white streams. He pulled his horse to a stop. Below him, scattered among the cliffs, was the Apache settlement. Through his spyglass, he saw them clearly, men, women, children, and then, impossibly, her Clara. She sat by the riverbank surrounded by laughing children. Her hair, long and sun-bleached, was tied back with a strip of leather. Her skin had darkened from the sun. Her hands, once soft, were roughened with work. She looked nothing like the fragile girl he had left behind. She looked alive. Keen's hand trembled on the glass. He watched as a tall figure approached her, Taza, and placed something in her hands. She laughed, a sound carried even by the wind that reached his ears. A strange pain twisted in his chest. It wasn't just jealousy. It was something deeper. Realization. His daughter had found a life beyond him. He urged his horse down the slope, fury and shame warring inside him. The villagers saw him coming and scattered, shouting warnings. Men grabbed their bows. Women pulled children inside. But Clara did not move. She turned her head calmly toward the sound of hooves. "Father," she said when he stopped a few feet away. Her voice was steady. Keen dismounted, boots hitting the earth hard. "You're coming home," he barked. "No," she said simply. "You don't belong here. I didn't belong with you either." He froze, not expecting the words to land so easily, so deadly. "Do you know what people say about you?" he hissed. "That you've lost your mind. That you've been taken in by savages." Clara's eyes narrowed. "If being among them is madness, then I don't want to be sane." Taza stepped forward. "She stays." Keen's hand went to his revolver. "Stay out of this, boy." But Clara's voice cut through the tension. "Put it away, father." Something in her tone, calm, commanding, made him obey before he realized it. She looked at him then, not as a child looks at a parent, but as one human being judges another. "All your life," she said softly, "you taught me that strength meant never bending. But the desert taught me something else. Strength is knowing when to stop fighting." Her words hung in the still air. The sheriff, for the first time in his life, had nothing to say. He looked at her, at the woman she had become, radiant and unafraid, and felt his pride crumble like dry earth under rain. Without another word, he turned, mounted his horse, and rode away. The wind carried his figure into the horizon until he was swallowed by dust. For the first time, the mighty Sheriff Keen had no one left to command, not his town, not his fortune, not even his daughter. All he had left was silence. The morning after her father disappeared into the desert, the air over the valley was still and cool. The sun crept slowly over the red cliffs, turning the river into a strip of molten gold. Clara sat at the water's edge, feeling the warmth on her face and the pull of quiet peace deep inside her chest. He was gone. No word, no farewell, just the fading thunder of hooves and the whisper of dust. Yet she felt no hatred. What she felt was release, as if a great chain had finally broken. For years she had been bound by duty, by shame, by the weight of a father's pride. Now for the first time she could breathe freely. Taza approached quietly, carrying a carved wooden staff in his hand. "For you," he said, placing it beside her. The staff was smooth, its top bound with leather and decorated with a single hawk feather. She ran her fingers over the grain. "It's beautiful," she whispered. "It will help you walk," he said. She laughed softly. "I can't walk," he smiled. Maybe not like before. For days afterward, he and the women of the village helped her learn how to balance with her arms, using the staff and a pair of crude braces. It was agonizing work. Her hands blistered, her arms shook, her breath came ragged, but she didn't stop. She would drag herself forward inch by inch until she could stand upright for a moment before collapsing again. Each time she fell, the children would cheer her on, clapping and shouting her name. Clara. Clara. By the end of the week, she could take 3 uneven steps on her own. When she finally stood tall under the rising sun, the village erupted in laughter and applause. Tears streamed down her face. Taza stood beside her, quiet and proud, watching her reclaim the sky. That night, a fire burned high in the center of the village. The drums beat slow and steady, echoing through the valley like a heartbeat. The people danced, not just for her, but with her. Clara sat among them, her legs wrapped in blankets, her heart light and fierce. Taza's father approached her with the solemn grace of age. "You are one of us now," he said. "Not because you live here, but because you have learned what it means to endure." She bowed her head. "Thank you." He looked into the fire, then back at her. "Your father thought you were broken," he said. "But the earth breaks open to let life grow." The words sank deep into her. She realized then that pain was not something to be ashamed of. It was the soil where strength took root. Weeks turned into months. Spring came, bringing green shoots and cool rains. Clara's lessons continued. She taught the children to write their names, to count, to tell their stories in words that might one day reach beyond the desert. The women taught her their crafts, weaving, grinding, healing with herbs. Her hair grew long, her arms strong, her laughter louder. Sometimes, when the wind came from the east, she thought she could still hear the faint echo of a horse on distant rock, her father's ghost passing through the canyons. She did not hate him anymore. She pitied him. His world had been made of walls. Hers now was made of open sky. One evening, as the sun dipped low, Taza joined her by the river. They sat in silence for a long time, the air heavy with the scent of rain. "Do you ever miss them?" she asked quietly. "The ones you've lost?" He nodded, "Always. But the land keeps them close. Every storm, every star, they are still here." She smiled faintly. "Then maybe my mother is here too." Taza looked at her, eyes warm. "She is in you." Clara gazed out across the water. The surface shimmered, reflecting the sky. She saw herself there, not the broken girl in her father's house, but a woman carved by fire and dust and love. And she knew then, with absolute certainty, that her father's cruel joke had become her salvation. He had tried to humiliate her, but the desert, the Apache, and her own unyielding will had taught her something far greater. That strength was never about walking tall. It was about rising again and again, from the ground, and in the vast stillness of the valley as dusk fell over the land. Clara Keene, once the paralyzed daughter of a proud man, finally stood taller than she ever had before.